and to US EPA for joining with us and putting this presentation for you all together. We're excited about it, and I think it'll be really helpful for folks as they prepare for grant submissions this fall. For today, we have several good things to go through, and I just want to run through the agenda and give you a quick overview of what we're doing and each speaker. So first up, we'll have Carla Ocker. She is from US EPA Region 5 in the Cleveland office. She's a project manager for a Brownfields grant, and she will be reviewing grant types from US EPA, funding limits, the evaluation process, and kind of giving you that basic information about what the grants are and how the evaluation of those happen at the regional level. And then Dan Jolker, he's my colleague here at Ohio EPA, he's Brownfield Coordinator. He's going to talk through the proposal through life of the project, and really that's an overview of what an assessment is, what you'll actually do with these grants and how that works. He'll also give you a quick overview of the Voluntary Action Program and how that works in Ohio. And then we'll have Beth Grigsby from SME. She's at the point of contact in Ohio for TAB, and she'll be going through really the meat and potatoes of today's session, which is tips for the grant writing process. So really the things that you need to know and start thinking about for your preparation and for the fall submission. And then finally, I'll just do a quick case study at the end, putting it all together, a success story. We'll be talking about a project from Elyria and how they were able to use different funding sources to make their project work. We'll do a quick closing at the end, also talk about some other funding options available to you here in Ohio, and then open it up for final questions.
Thanks, Katie.
We'll be ready for Carla. Thank you, Blaise.
Very good. Appreciate that. So yes, Carla Ocker's up with EPA Region 5, and she'll be giving us an overview of EPA Brownfields grants and assessment revolving loan and cleanup grants in particular. So Carla, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Blaise. As Blaise said, I'm Carla Ocker. I work for US EPA in Region 5, and I'm actually stationed in Westlake, Ohio. One of my primary duties is to act as a project officer or project manager, which means that I get to work with the grantees once they receive their grants. I help my grantees out with technical issues as well as programmatic and administrative issues and help them through our whole grant process. Next slide, please. Just to get started, I wanted to go over the types of grants that we have. The Brownfields program gives out many grants. The 6 most common ones are listed here, but the subject of today's presentation are the ARC grants, which stands for Assessment, Revolving Loan Fund, and Cleanup Grants. So those are the 3 that I'm going to address, starting with assessment. Next slide, please. First off, who's eligible to receive Brownfields grants? Generally, the tribes, any tribe, governmental or quasi-governmental agency is eligible to receive any of the 3 ARC grants: Assessment, Revolving Loan Fund, or Cleanup Grants. Nonprofits are eligible to receive cleanup grants, but cleanup grants only. In yellow at the bottom of the slide, I added just a little note that the grantee cannot be responsible for contamination on a site. The reason that I highlighted that, and I threw this in at the very beginning of my presentation, is that if you're going to apply for a grant to either assess or clean up a property that you own, you need to make sure that you've either done all appropriate inquiry, which means done an ASTM phase 1 before taking title, or you need to have taken that property involuntarily, for instance, off of a foreclosure list to eliminate blight. If you are in a situation where you do want to apply for a grant for a property that you own and you're not sure whether you've completed all appropriate inquiry or taken it involuntarily, please give me a call. My phone number and my email address is at the end of this presentation. So with that, moving on. The first type of grant I want to talk about is the assessment grants. Assessment grants can be used for phase 1, phase 2, and remedial action planning. The way I like to think of it is assessment grants can be used for all activities up to the point when you start digging dirt. And this is important in that assessment grants and cleanup grants do have some overlap in the kinds of activities that you can use the grant money for. A couple of things I want to point out, one in particular is the grantee can do assessments for private entities, and they can do it for public entities as well. But the point is, you don't have to own the property to be able to assess the property. For example, if a city can pay for a phase 1 and or a phase 2 on a property so that a potential purchaser can obtain financing. So we're all about facilitating redevelopment, facilitating property transactions, and making it easy for redevelopment to occur. Assessment grants have a 3-year project period. Most of our grants are awarded on October 1st of the given year after you apply. So if you apply in what would be called FY18, which would be this fall, you would get your money by October 1st next year in year 18, October 1st of 2018, and you would have 3 years until September 30th of 2021 to spend the money. The assessment grants, you have to apply for petroleum money or hazardous substance money or a combination of the two. And the reason that we have 2 different pots of money is because the Brownfields law is an amendment to CERCLA or Superfund, better known as Superfund. And oil is exempt from Superfund. So we have to have 2 pots of money, the petroleum money and the hazardous substance money. Next slide, please. Assessment grants, you can be either community-wide or site-specific. The community-wide grants offer you a lot more flexibility than a site-specific grant. Site-specific grants, you identify the site that you want to assess, and your money can only be spent on that site. If you apply for a community-wide grant, however, you can spend all of your money on one site if you want to, but if you get to the end of the project and say you come in for a $200,000 hazardous substance assessment grant and you only need $180,000 on your target site, you can use that other $20,000 on another property within the geographic area that you define in your grant application. So if you're a city, your geographic area probably would be the city limits. A couple things I want to notice, note is that cities or municipalities, counties can partner with private developers for the public entity to come in and receive an assessment grant to assess a property for a private developer. There is no cost share requirement with assessment grants, and the grantee does not have to own the site. So a grantee can assess other public entity sites as well as private entity sites. And the grantee just cannot be liable for the contamination on the site. However, if you want to assess a site, if you're the grantee and you want to assess the site owned by somebody else who is a responsible party as defined in CERCLA, it's okay, you can do that, because as long as you, the grantee, are not a responsible party, you can assess that property. Next slide, please, or next slide, please. So how much money can you get with an assessment grant? A single applicant can apply for up to $200,000 of petroleum money or $200,000 of hazardous substance money. Now, if you want a little bit of petroleum money and a little bit of hazardous substance money, you can apply for a combination of up to $300,000. But any one type, petro or haz sub, cannot exceed the $200,000 limit. So you could request $200,000 in hazardous substance money and $100,000 in petroleum money, or you could split it, 150 petroleum, 150 hazardous substance money. Now, We spoke a little bit about the difference between a community-wide assessment and a site-specific assessment. And as I said, US EPA really encourages most grantees to apply for a community-wide assessment grant, even if you only want to assess one site or think you only want to need all that money for one site. But there is an advantage to a site-specific assessment grant if your site's going to require more than $200,000 to do the assessment, say an old foundry, an old factory, because you can request a waiver of up to $350,000 for a site-specific assessment grant. Now, you can come in as a single applicant, as I said, or you can form a coalition with other applicants. And a couple of the advantages of forming a coalition is that, number one, you can apply for more money. You can ask for up to $600,000. And number two, you're increasing the geographic boundaries within which you can spend your assessment money. Now, as logic has it, coalition assessment grants have to be community-wide. They cannot be site-specific. Next slide, please. Cleanup grants. Now, cleanup grants, on the other hand, are only site-specific, and the grantee must own the site. So you have to be very, very careful that if you want to apply for a cleanup grant, you must make sure that you have done all appropriate inquiry before you've taken ownership of the property, or that you've taken this property involuntarily to eliminate blight. Oftentimes, communities will receive properties off the foreclosure list. And for the purpose of our grants, that's considered an involuntary acquisition, and you should be fine. Once again, if you're coming in for a cleanup grant, I highly suggest that you give me a call, and we can make sure that you're going to pass the threshold of not being a responsible party for the contamination on the site. There is a 20% cost share for cleanup grants. And it's okay if the cost share comes from a private entity. Say, for instance, you have a site that a private individual or a private company owns, but private individuals and companies are not eligible for cleanup grants. It's okay for the property to be transferred to the public entity. The public entity then apply for a cleanup grant, clean the site up, and then transfer that property back to the private entity. That's okay by US EPA. Once again, what we care about is facilitating redevelopment. Eligible entities for the cleanup grants, once again, are tribes, governmental entities, quasi-governmental entities, for example, land banks, and nonprofits. Once again, nonprofits, this is the only kind of grant a nonprofit is eligible to receive. We've given cleanup grants to land banks, I'm sorry, not to land banks. We've given them to like colleges, because those are if they're a nonprofit entity. But if they're a public entity or a governmental entity, then we could go ahead and give it to them too. Next slide, please. Cleanup grants, you can receive up to $200,000 per site. One thing that's important here, I say per site, because the grantee defines the limits of the site. So if you have a large property that can be logically divided into multiple sites, you can apply, most years, you can apply for up to 3 cleanup grants. The number of cleanup grants that you can apply for each year changes depending on how much funding we have. But in the past, 3 cleanup grants has been kind of our typical go-to number. So if there's a logical way to break the site up, you need to write 3 cleanup applications, and you could potentially get up to $600,000 for your overall project. Cleanup grants can be for petroleum or hazardous substance money, or a combination of the two. They have a 3-year project period, just like the assessment grants, and they can be used for limited sampling, remedial action planning, and cleanup, obviously. The limited sampling and remedial action planning is where the cleanup grants overlap with the activities that can be conducted for the assessment grants. And just for clarification, limited sampling means, say for instance, you already have your remedial action plan, but you need to do a little more sampling so that you can better define how much waste you have to dispose of, so you can put together an accurate bid specification. That's the kind of sampling we mean by limited sampling. You cannot do assessments with cleanup money. Next slide, please. Now, the revolving loan fund grants, these, you need to really think hard before you apply for a revolving loan fund grant. The revolving loan fund, developing a revolving loan fund program is somewhat complex and it's very time consuming. And what we have found is that the larger the geographic area and the larger, more sophisticated the grantee, the more successful or the more likely that the grantee will be successful in creating a revolving loan fund program. Another thing that we've noticed is that if you think you're going to get a revolving loan fund and you think that your revolving loan fund is going to spark redevelopment in your area, and there's not already some momentum for redevelopment in the area, then the revolving loan fund isn't usually a good catalyst to actually get redevelopment started. It's really, really cool if there's already some momentum in the area. The loans, once you receive a revolving loan fund grant, you can make loans to private or government entities, but subgrants can only go to public entities, governmental, quasi-governmental agencies, or nonprofits. There is a 20% cost share required for a revolving loan fund grant, but that can be passed on to the loan recipient. Oftentimes in the applications, the applicant will, like the revolving loan fund application to US EPA, they will say that the 20% cost share is going to be passed on to the loan and or subrecipient. And that's one box checked. You don't have to worry about justifying where you're going to get your 20% cost share. That's good enough for US EPA. Now, the performance period for revolving loan fund grants is a little bit longer. It's 5 years because we realize it takes usually a year to 18 months just to get the program set up. The loan periods can be longer than 5 years. You don't have to close out, the loans don't have to be repaid within that 5 years. However, the money has to be out the door and loaned or subgranted by the end of that 5-year project period. Next slide, please. One thing I want to note is that current RLF grantees are eligible for supplemental funding, which means that you don't have to compete competitively for additional revolving loan fund money. Once a year, usually once a year, once in a while we skip a year, but in general, once a year, US EPA puts out a notice to all of our current revolving loan fund grantees saying that we have some money that's available for supplemental funding. Now, you need to make sure that you've got a project. You might have to have most of your money already loaned or subgranted, and you need to have a project that's ready to move within the next couple of months to be able to be eligible for the supplemental funding. We've kind of tightened that up over the years. And then just one more note, the larger the geographic area, the better off, or the more likely that you'll be successful with your revolving loan fund. Next slide, please. Revolving loans, you can ask for up to $1 million per eligible entity. The last few years, because of budget constraints, we've usually only awarded $600,000 per eligible entity. And you can form a coalition of 2 or more eligible entities and ask for up to $1 million per entity. Sometimes we'll give out the full $1 million if you have a coalition. Petroleum and hazardous substances funding can be asked for in one grant application, but you have to have a separate budget. And you can subgrant up to 50% of the funds that you are granted. So if you're given $600,000 with in your grant, then you can subgrant up to $300,000 of that. But the other $300,000 must go out as loans with a repayment scheme. Loans can go to private entities. I mentioned that earlier. Subgrants have to go to public entities, governmental, quasi-governmental agencies, and nonprofits. And one thing to note is the RLF grantee determines the terms of the loan. You get to set how soon you want the loan repaid. Oftentimes, RLF loans are used as gap financing. Like part of the cleanup will be funded with private loans, and the rest will be funded with the RLF with an RLF loan or subgrant. But for the loans, you can delay the repayment of that loan and for a period of time, say a few years, until the redevelopment gets up and running, which is a really, really attractive feature of our loans. Okay, next slide, please. When to apply. Our guidelines will be released in the fall of 2017, and you can go to epa.gov/brownfields and hit grants and funding. If you'd like to see guidelines from years past, they're still up there on the website, and that'll give you an idea of what some of the questions are that you need to answer in your application. We usually give entities 6 to 8 weeks to complete the application, and the applications need to be submitted through grants.gov. You can't just email them to us anymore. Last year was the first year that it was mandatory to submit through grants.gov, and there were some bugs that needed to be worked out. And Beth is going to talk more specifically about how to submit through grants.gov a little bit later in this webinar. Next slide, please. So just a little bit on how we do our reviews within the region. The grant applications are broken up into 2 sections. One is the threshold criteria, and those are yes/no answers. And we, the reviewers, can ask applicants for clarification. Say, for instance, you forget to include the deed for the property showing that you own the property. We can call you and ask you for that information. And the threshold criteria is reviewed by the home region. So if you're in Region 5, your threshold criteria will be reviewed by a Region 5 person. Just to note, there's one ranking criterion that is also reviewed within the region, and that's the programmatic capability. Programmatic capability is you're given a number score, like a score for it. But we review that within the region because it's more likely that we would have good knowledge of the applicant and be able to do a good review of whether they're capable of managing a grant. The second section is the ranking criteria, and those are scored answers. The reviewers absolutely cannot talk to applicants about the ranking criteria. So what's in your application is the only thing we're allowed to look at. We're not even allowed to go online and look up a map of your site or look up newspaper articles about a project. So make sure that you pretend you're talking to someone who knows absolutely nothing about your project. The ranking criterion are reviewed by one home region person, so one person from Region 5, and either 1 or 2 people from outside the region. And the reason I put 1 or 2 people from outside the region is because assessment grants are reviewed by one home reviewer, one outside brownfields person, so another person like me from a different region, and one federal partner. The federal partner might be ATSDR, someone from HUD, or say from the Corps of Engineers. Now the cleanup and RLF grants are reviewed by one home region, quote, matter expert. So, oftentimes like our cleanup grants are reviewed by people who've done cleanups. Either they've been in the consulting world, or like myself, I did emergency response for years and years and did a lot of cleanups. So I oftentimes will review the cleanup grant applications. And then RLF and cleanup grants are also reviewed by one outside region matter expert, so another person who knows about cleanups and RLF. One thing I want to mention is this is the process by which we kind of push, or by which we review the applications, is both scorers, the home reviewer and then the 1 or 2 other people who are reviewing the application. We each score our applications independently, and then our scores are sent to what we call the national program manager, and that person is or national panel manager, sorry. And that person views the scores from the different independent reviewers, and if the scores are pretty close to each other, the scores are averaged, and that's the number that gets put down on the spreadsheet and sent to headquarters. But if there's a discrepancy between the scores of, say, more than 10 points for an overall application or on a particular criteria, if there's more than 1 or 2 points difference, we'll convene a panel that that consists of the 2 or 3 reviewers and the national panel coordinator. So then, and we're able to talk about our different, about the differences that we saw in the application, because sometimes we'll miss something. Sometimes there's a question that one reviewer sees as answered in a different section than where the question is asked. So we try to get our scores a little bit closer together and make sure we're coming up and do a good review. Next slide, please. Now, the threshold criteria, just to go over kind of what that is, what kinds of questions are asked in threshold criteria. We talk about whether the applicant is eligible, governmental entity, quasi-governmental entity, tribe or nonprofit. We ask questions to make sure that the site is a brownfields and that the site is not excluded from being eligible for brownfields funding by being on the national priorities list or under enforcement with from US EPA or subject to another federal cleanup program. In the guidelines, there's detailed information regarding applicant and site eligibility. So I suggest you look at some guidelines from last year, and then once our guidelines from this year are out, look at those and make sure that you have an eligible site and you are an eligible entity. Next slide, please. The ranking criteria, here's some of the things that we ask about under ranking criteria. Community need, that includes things like demographics of your area and the financial need. We really score heavily the project description and feasibility of success for the overall project. If you have a $1 million cleanup and you're asking us for $200,000 for that cleanup and you don't show any leveraged funds to where you're going to get the other $800,000, your feasibility of success is going to be pretty low. We look at community partnerships. So please, even if you can start now, make sure that you hook up with some grassroots community organizations because we're going to ask you whether you have those sorts of relationships set up. Project benefits and programmatic capability. Once again, that's how good you are at filling out your paperwork and getting your reports in on time. And that is reviewed within the region. Next slide, please. If you want additional information, once again, it's the EPA.gov Brownfield site. The Federal Register notice will be posted on that site, and the Federal Register notice will tell you that the guidelines are available. And you can also find fact sheets regarding successful applications in the past that tell you what kind of projects we've funded in the past. And then lastly, there's my email address and my phone number. Please give me a call if you have any questions. I'm happy to help you out until the guidelines are published. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Carla. What we want to do is take a quick break to see if we have any chat questions to try to answer on what Carla talked about, which is summarized here in the slide I'm showing on the chat questions slide for those following along on the phone. And we have actually not received any yet. So just wanted to maybe ask the speakers, were there any points you thought were especially relevant or things that could be clarified? Anything from the speakers that we'd like to ask or add? One thing I might mention is I think a point you made, Carla, and it might be made again, that applicants can talk to EPA, especially about threshold, requirements like site eligibility before the grant competition starts. So, today or all the way up till sometime in the fall when the grant competition starts, the time is the time to talk to Carla about, whether your project would be eligible for a certain type of grant, and so on and so forth. EPA Region 5 is very helpful with that among all the EPA regions TAB works in.
Yes, and I can even talk to you about whether your project would be competitive and give you some tips on how to make it more competitive, ways you can approach your application or present your project to EPA. Once the guidelines are out, though, then I'm only allowed to talk to you about threshold issues.
Great. Anything else from any of our other speakers?
I don't think so. It's Katie. Carla does a great job of giving us a nice overview of grants and the opportunities through EPA Brownfield. So thank you, Carla.
Oh, you know, one other point that I do want to make, and I did make it during the presentation, but it's very important. Write that grant application as if someone knows nothing about your area, because your grant application might be reviewed by somebody who lives in, you know, a booming metropolis and has no idea what it's like to live in the Rust Belt. So just
good point.
keep that in mind.
Very good point. Well, thanks, Carla.
Sure.
Okay, we'll bring up our next speaker, Dan Cholker, another brownfield coordinator with Ohio EPA, Katie's colleague, and he's going to give more of the specifics about the environmental assessment and cleanup work that these types of grants that Carla was talking about funds, and in the context of how Ohio EPA works brownfields in Ohio. So Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Blaze. Yes, this is Dan Cholker. I'm trained in geology as in my background, and I've been at the Ohio EPA for 27 years, and the last 16 years working with brownfields. If we move to the first slide, this is probably a key slide before we get more into process and activities. It's important that you get approvals for eligibility of the project prior to starting any work on the project. And in Ohio, if you have a petroleum grant award, you'll need a separate approval letter from our Ohio's Bureau of Underground Storage Tank Regulations, or we call it BUSTER. They regulate tanks in Ohio. And then if you have a hazardous substance grant, you'll need approval from your project coordinator, and that likely will be Carla. And our next slide kind of gets into the evaluation process for reusing properties. And brownfield properties are everywhere. As the brownfield definition states, expansion and reuse is hindered by its known or perceived past use. You're trying to find out what were the past uses of the property, and did those activities cause contamination to be released on the property. The goal of the evaluation is to remove or understand the stigma that prevents the property from being reused. And the steps are outlined here: phase 1, phase 2, remedy, and reuse. We'll get into, we'll look at each one of these as we move forward. So the phase 1, this is a very important first step that you must do before making any decisions regarding purchasing a piece of property, selling it, redeveloping it, obtaining any financing, or going through a foreclosure process. Phase 1 is a common product used in the real estate and banking industry. From a buyer's perspective, the phase 1 will investigate the history of the property. Records are reviewed to tell a story about the past use of the property. The phase 1 establishes a defense from federal Superfund liability. The buyer receives protection from federal and sometimes state enforcement by establishing that they did not cause or contribute to any contamination on the property. With a phase 1, a new owner may be able to avoid liability for cleanup of a property. However, the owner must still take appropriate measures to protect users of the property if any contamination is present. And finally, a phase 1 will help you understand any environmental risks the property may pose. A highly industrial property with a lot of chemical uses in the past is more likely to be contaminated and may pose higher risks than a property with limited past use of chemicals. By looking at past uses and establishing the property history, the likelihood of contamination can be established. The property may be less contaminated, or its stigma may be overstated. Next slide, please. Various protocols have been established to standardize and provide consistency for conducting phase 1 investigations. AAI, or All Appropriate Inquiry, Carla talked about that a little bit, as a common nationwide mechanism typically tied to the ASTM standard for doing a phase 1. In Ohio, we have an additional phase 1 in our voluntary action program, or we call that VAP. There's a standard built in regulation on how to do a phase 1 for that process. You're not required to do a VAP phase 1. The the user can decide whichever one they like to follow. But the AAI is probably the most important one prior to a property transaction, because that's how you can get your liability protections from Superfund, and it can also show that you didn't cause or contribute to contamination. Environmental professionals conduct the phase 1, and in Ohio, a certified professional will sign off on a phase 1 report. It includes a variety of information. It usually results in a large stack of papers and a thick document. We review any records that agencies may have, whether it's EPA records, state or federal EPA, the Department of Natural Resources, health departments, local health departments, and often fire departments have some records, and the state fire marshal or buster, which we talked about briefly earlier, may have records. You look through historic records. There's a variety of sources out there, and there's companies that have databases that look through that information, and they're often ordered with the phase 1 to summarize that background information. You may conduct interviews of past workers or project managers who may have worked in a facility, and sometimes you get interviews from neighbors or people nearby. The evaluation is primarily for the property, and in certain instances, you may also look at adjacent and nearby properties to find out if other contamination may be coming onto your property. It's purely a paperwork process. There are no samples are taken, and there's no lab analysis. In the next slide, there's some add-ons that you can order with the phase 1. The first 4 are really building materials. So if there's a structure on the site and you may want to reuse it, or you're going to demolish it, you may need to find out a little more information about asbestos, radon, lead paint, and lead in the drinking water. Often that's associated with lead piping. And then certain larger properties may have wetlands that may impact future redevelopment options. Now, the next bullet is probably the most important feature of your phase 1, because at the end, in the summary, they will tell you what areas of the property are known to be impacted or potentially impacted. And those are called RECs, Recognized Environmental Conditions, or identified areas, and that's a voluntary action program term. Costs are typically around $2,000 to $9,000. In our brownfield section, we do assessments, and these are typical but average costs that we encounter for doing a phase 1. And typically in a 30 to 90 day time frame, they can be completed. Next slide. So we move to phase 2, where we determine, this is where you actually do sampling to determine what levels may be present. Samples are collected for soil, groundwater, sediment, surface water, or vapor. And there's a couple pictures at the top of a geoprobe. It's a direct push system that puts a tube into the ground and collects a soil sample. You can also collect groundwater with those. And then for a lab analysis, I just listed some common compounds that are analyzed. You'll see data that will come back for your property. Next slide. So ultimately, the phase 2 goal is to determine what the applicable, to match your concentrations to applicable standards, whether the standards can be risk-based, whether you're trying to meet a residential or unrestricted use versus more of a commercial industrial setting. And you can also often compare concentrations to background. A screening phase 2 is usually used for smaller properties. It's a quick look. You bias your samples to worst areas of the property to see if contaminants may be present. Hopefully you find little to no impacts to show low risk and can have greater comfort to purchase or develop a piece of property. And these, again, averages $10,000 to $50,000. You can do a basic phase 2, get enough information to understand more of a smaller property with a limited number of RECs or IAs. Oftentimes for a comprehensive phase 2, where you may be moving to a cleanup, you'll need to define the extent of contamination, or there's more data analysis and modeling needed. These can approach $50,000 or more, or take up an entire $200,000 assessment grant if you're focusing on a single larger piece of property. And completion time it's kind of dependent on how many times you have to go out to sample. Often within 3 months to a year, you can assess a typical brownfield property. So the outcome of your phase 2, you'll understand what contaminants are present, their depth and concentration. You'll compare it to applicable standards. In some cases, a risk assessment may be needed if you need to further define the impacts of a property. If it meets the standard, you can make decisions and maybe proceed to purchasing the property or refinancing it or even reusing the property. In cases where standards are not met, you may have to move on to a remedy, and that'll be our next slide. If cleanup is needed, there are a variety of options available. Many times reuse and redevelopment can work around the contamination and leave it in place. Measures to prevent people from getting in contact with the contamination is an acceptable remedy. You don't always need to dig and haul the contamination from the property. So if you know the planned use of the property, you can select remedies that could be incorporated into a development plan. So for instance, caps and covers like parking lots, foundations, and landscaping can be used to prevent contact with contaminants. This is risk-based cleanup and is acceptable to regulatory agencies. Sometimes groundwater use restrictions can be used to eliminate the use and installation of drinking water wells. And vapor barriers and mitigation systems can eliminate vapors from entering existing or future buildings that may be constructed on the property. In our next slide, an environmental professional is used to develop a remedial action plan, and that's the document that describes the remedies that will be used to ensure that the property can be reused. Cost estimates are usually fairly detailed about all the pieces and parts of the remedy will be included. And you also may cover additional activities like demolition, removal of asbestos, and removal of waste. A lot of old buildings, sometimes there's we call it universal waste, paint cans, cleaners, and solid waste may be spread throughout the building and may need to be removed as well. So the endpoint for a cleanup, if US EPA and Ohio funding sources are being used, you may need to enter the VAP and get a no further action letter as an endpoint, and this would result in a covenant not to sue from the state. If you're implementing a remedy outside of a grant or trying to reuse a property, you can rely on the environmental professional's opinion. If you compare it to a standard, you don't necessarily have to give anything to the state, but you should save your documentation. So the next slide, if you can have a successful project, you can move a blighted, boarded up building into in this case, a new office building that has transformed a property to remove that former blight. And then the last 3 slides are kind of a little more detail on some of these add-ons. An asbestos survey, we brought that up briefly. These are typically cost around $2,000 to $10,000 for a typical building. And it's important to identify the friable asbestos that needs to be removed. Destructive sampling is very important to make sure that you get behind walls and ceilings. It's often hidden behind these features. And certified inspectors are also important to make sure that the survey complies with standards. In our next slide, we talk a little bit more about geophysical surveys. This is often used at underground storage tank sites. Often you don't know if they're still in the ground, so GPR and EM are 2 techniques you can use. You're scanning the surface of the property to find these buried metal objects. And these typically cost around $2,500. And then our last ecological survey, these are less common. It's if you have a wetland or a stream on your property, you may have to do additional assessment if these features were impacted by past uses of the property. And these typically we see costs around $35,000 or more to do these types of assessment work. So in summary, there are numerous assessment tools in the toolbox to evaluate your brownfield property. With data in hand, informed decisions regarding reuse of the property can be made. Should you receive a grant, please feel free to contact any one of the presenters today. We'd be happy to discuss your project. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan. Very, very informative, and listed a few of maybe the points you talked about on the Let's Take Chat Questions slide, which is showing now. Wanted to see if we have any more chat questions. It doesn't look like we have any, so either you're a very educated audience or you're totally bewildered you with all kinds of information, but I have a feeling you're a very savvy audience. I'd like to, while we're waiting for any questions, I'd like to just give an opportunity for the speakers to comment or ask questions of Dan.
This is Carla. I just have one comment. I'm with EPA, and the comment is that for the Brownfields Assessment Grants, phase ones that are done with Brownfields Assessment money must be done. They must be AAI compliant, so they have to follow the ASTM standards. However, the phase ones can be done to be compliant with both ASTM and VAP, or ASTM and I forget what the other type of phase one was that Dan had up there. But just a point.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
And isn't it true also, Carla and Dan, that if you know, let's say a community is using EPA money or Ohio EPA money to pay for this work, that they need to be also connected with the state and the VAP program as well? Is that true?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question again, please?
That if EPA money's funding the, you know, let's say a city got a grant, an assessment grant from EPA, if they're hiring contractors and paying for this assessment work, it needs to be in partnership with Ohio's VAP program?
It doesn't have to be, but it's in their best interest if it is.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, well, we often encourage people to at least collect VAP certified data so that the data can be used if it would support a voluntary action. It's not, like Carla said, not required. But as we indicated too, if you go on to cleanup or you have a cleanup grant, then you may be required to be in VAP. So it's to your advantage to have that VAP information at the beginning. So as Carla said too, we do AAI and VAP compliant phase ones. We encourage communities to do that, so you cover both. And in our phase two, we'll collect samples that would assist a voluntary action program phase two should it be needed in the future.
Very good. And you know, the importance then of scoping, you know, those, if a community has a grant and has hired environmental contractors to do this work, you know, if maybe if you're looking for, you know, for HUD money someday for some of the bricks and mortar work, or, you know, if you're going to have other federal partners and there could be wetlands issues and things like that, the point that Dan brought up about, you know, getting the wetlands evaluations done, or, you know, if they're, but to properly scope, you know, think ahead and properly scope your assessment work so that you're eligible for, you know, not only the VAP, but also for other types of funding. That's important too. Okay, any other comments? If not, we will move on to Beth Grigsby. who will be telling us about how the TAB program can help, a little bit on that, help you prepare competitive proposals to EPA for art grants, and some grant writing tips to address those threshold and ranking criteria portions of the proposal. And Beth is a TAB partner, and she'll introduce herself a little bit more. So Beth, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you, Blaze. I'm a senior project consultant for SME, but I'm also act as the TAB partner and point of contact for the state of Ohio here. I have over 25 years experience in brownfields redevelopment. I started in an urban scenario, which was the city of Indianapolis back in the 90s, and then became the actual TAB coordinator out of Purdue University for EPA Region 5 back a few years back. So I've really got a good taste of urban and rural issues associated with redevelopment. Next slide. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about TAB. It is a national program funded by EPA. We provide free brownfields assistance to local governments and tribes, and Kansas State University provides the EPA services in regions 5, 6, 7, and 8. And of course, Ohio is in region 5. Thank you. Next. So TAB assistance is tailored to meet your needs, the community needs. It's typically coordinated through a city, tribal, nonprofit, brownfields project manager. We like to work on projects that have local government support. Communities are accepted on a first-come basis and depends on staffing, funding availability. And I've never known TAB in the last, I'd probably say at least, 12, 13 years to say no to a community. We try. Kansas State in particular has a whole suite of professional folks that can help the communities. So we do not compete with consultants. We complement their services by supporting the local governments and building capacity to manage these projects. Next. So here are some, next slide, please.
And it's free, I guess, right?
Oh yeah, yes, and it's free, it's free.
It's free, okay, here we go.
Okay, so if you look on the next slide, this gives you an idea of the type of services. It's not comprehensive, but it gives you a good idea. I've identified in red here services that may help you with grant writing or putting together a successful grant application. Identifying and inventorying brownfields. If you're a novice and haven't been through the process and would like some background on that, that tab is certainly fit to do that, and we can also assist you with prioritization process if you need. We can assist with strategic planning, redevelopment, visioning, which may be if you have a site and you know you need to address it, but you're not quite sure how you want to address it, TAB can assist you in putting together a visioning session and bringing in the community stakeholders to discuss what might be the highest and best use for a site. Of course, the grant writing e-tool, which I'll talk about briefly here in a few minutes, review of grant applications. I'll keep saying this over and over. That's very helpful for communities. It helps give you an idea. We won't write the grant for you, but we will certainly direct you into ways that you might make your grant application more competitive. And workshops, webinars like today, and the design of your community outreach, community stakeholder education. Those are some ways that TAB can help you with your grant writing process. Next slide. So anyway, the best way to start your grant application process is to just face the facts. These things take time. It's a national competition. It's likely that you are competing against Cleveland, New York, Tampa. I mean, it isn't just Ohio communities in Ohio. It's all across the nation. And reviewing the guidelines can take time. And even if you're having a consultant assist you with writing the application, you should read the guidelines yourself just to know what you're getting into. Also, there's different guidelines for each grant type. You need to start educating your community, gathering input from the community on what sites that they're interested in seeing redeveloped, identifying your grassroots organizations, and assimilating reliable data into your community story. All this takes time, some research, even if you've been in your community your whole life. It does help to get some ideas on where to gather that data. Next slide. So anyway, here we go. That's Blaze as a young child.
Before I could fly.
He's always been he's always been about brownfields. So Kansas State is here. Blaze has made sure that he has a staff that has very specialized experience in brownfields and brownfields redevelopment, not just in big cities, small cities, rural communities, but tribes, nonprofits. They have the expertise. Kansas State also has many TAB partners, just like myself, and experts who specialize in the many facets of brownfields redevelopment and, of course, grant writing for resources. Next slide. And that brings us to the Tab Easy. This is something that I really encourage communities to do. Again, consultants should use it if you'd like. Tab Easy helps you go through the process, make sure that you're responding to the right criteria for the type of grant. Just simply go to tabeasy.org and create an account. Next slide. And the Tab Easy features are user-friendly. It can be accessed anytime at user's own pace. I was part of the development team on putting this together. I looked at the EPA guidelines and just said, whoa, I've been doing this for 15 years and I still don't understand it all. So we started working on something that I called a TurboTax approach to the EPA grant application, and really I think it's very helpful. You do provide a username, password, but your privacy is protected. However, you won't be on any email list except to inform you of other TAB workshops, training that you might want to participate, and of course those updates on EPA guidelines. As a primary user, if you're the first one to start using and you are in charge of this grant application process, you can give access to collaborators and have them work together with you as a team. And then you can export your proposals to MS Word or PDF format from the web-based tool. Next. So if you take a look at this, it guides you through the grant process. This is an example of an outline for community-wide assessment. Check out the tutorial, but it really is very easy to go through. You do need to identify what type of grant you want to go for, community-wide, site-specific cleanup. We do not have revolving loan fund on the website at this point, maybe down the road. And then provide the application with your own name. And then once you've outlined the type of grant, then you get an outline of all the criteria specific to the grant that you are wanting to go after. Next slide. So Tab Easy benefits that you can get started with now. When you go on that website, you will see if you set up, let's say, a sample or test project, it'll guide you step by step through the grant, provides helpful hints throughout the process. But also take a look at those funding year 2017 assessment and cleanup grant guidelines from last year. It's very helpful to kind of get a feel for how things were responded to, what type. The guidelines change slightly year to year. Sometimes there's been some major changes, but not that frequently. Also, with the Tab Easy, you can see under EPA resources, the fact sheets are extremely valuable for you, as well as various guidance materials. Also, last year's National Outreach webinar slides, which was very, very informative. And then another piece of this, if you're new to this process, or even if you haven't done this for a few years, it's changed quite a bit, take a look at those sample successful proposals. Those proposals were selected by the EPA and are great examples for all different types of grants, including RLF. So you'll have assessment, cleanup, and RLF grants there to take a look at. Next slide. And that's what I mean about getting started now. You're starting your homework, take a look at the page, look at the resource, look at the applications to kind of get a better understanding of the comprehensive information you need for the grant. Check the quick links. There's lots of different information. Next page. And don't forget the tab will review your application. So let's say that we have announcements here in a week or two and you didn't make the cut. This is a great time for you to resubmit your application to tab and say, I'd like comments on this. First things first, if you don't receive a grant, please make sure you set up a debrief with EPA. But at the same time, tab can give you other very helpful, constructive comments on how to make your application more competitive. Give us about a 1 week or so to pull everything together. We'd like some notice before we start reviewing. Next. So I'll be talking very briefly, broadly about thresholds, application submittal and tips for writing the narrative. Next slide. And first things first. As it's been mentioned, I think, a couple times, are you eligible to receive the funds? This is something you can check out. I think you could call Ohio EPA, you could call TAB, you can call Carla to find out if you are an eligible entity, if you have doubts about that. If you're forming a coalition assessment, you need to make sure that your coalition members are eligible to receive funds. Are they local government, cities, towns, tribes? If it's site-specific or cleanup, is the site itself eligible? Again, I think you can always start at Ohio EPA, but Carla would be very, very helpful with that as well. Some of these things can be tricky. If it's a cleanup grant, of course, do you or will you own that property prior to application submittal? Next. And first things first, continue. Now that we're submitting through grants.gov, there's a couple more hoops. So you need to make sure that you have a DUNS number. Confirm that you have a DUNS number. Make sure you're registered with the System for Award Management, SAMS, and make sure that that registration is current. The reason why you want to do that now is because some of these things take time. It may take over a month to get your DUNS number and or confirmation of your registration. You may register, but you need the confirmation that you're registered. We had some hiccups last year where people weren't ready. They couldn't submit their application because they weren't registered with SAMS. As I say, make sure it's an active account. Complete the authorized organization representative. And I will say that EPA had fact sheets just on grants.gov alone that I believe are very helpful. Next slide. By the way, back to the other slide, there's no leniency, there's no forgiveness. It's one of those things you have to have it done. Now next slide, we'll get into ranking criteria, broadly discuss the typical criteria or sections that you need to respond to for all the grants, which is community need, project description, feasibility of success, community engagement, partnerships, project benefits, programmatic capability, and past performance. Each criterion is made up of sub-criteria. Answer everything. Don't leave things blank. If it doesn't apply, say so. Sub-criteria may be different per grant type. Don't take it for granted that just because you're doing a site-specific assessment versus an assessment from last year that you're going to have the same point total. Next slide. And then community need. This is the beginning of a compelling story that you need to tell. This section is going to set the stage for the rest of the proposal. And a former EPA Region 5 coordinator would say, in this section, you've got to make them cry. Assume also that, as Carla mentioned earlier, the reviewer may be somewhere in Hawaii, which all of us might want to be in, but and knows nothing about your community, nothing about you. You've got to make sure you tell the story of your community and how brownfields have affected and impacted your community. Identify a targeted area. I put this map up here. It's an urban area, but they went about with a Google Maps application, very simple, put addresses in, and all of a sudden they could see a corridor that was a very likely corridor to address brownfields in. And also that particular corridor had a TIF as well as other transportation funds associated with it. So it was a great target area. Who is impacted? Got to think back to who is impacted. So let's go back to that target area. It could be a census tract, it could be a neighborhood, it could be a corridor, it could be a river, waterways. Look around that area and who is impacted. Look at the sensitive populations in that area. Sensitive may be the elderly or the very young, pregnant women. Are there populations that you have that may have language barriers or impoverished, unemployed? Those are the things that you're looking at in terms of what area, who is impacted and how are they impacted. So when you look at how they are impacted, you're taking a look at not only brownfields, but the cumulative environmental sources of contamination in your community. And that can result in very poor health. It can result in, you have maybe take a look at asthma rates, lung disease, poor quality of life, unsafe neighborhoods, maybe crime is an impact of brownfields. So you take a look, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of providing more information about your targeted area and those that are impacted by it. Next slide. So the next slide is really more of a rural area where they plotted their sites, and of course kind of clearly see that they have a corridor of sites of buildings that are vacant now because a major employer left, and very much impoverished in this area. The buildings are havens for drug abusers. They've had high incidence of lung cancer, suicide, drug overdoses, infant mortality. Build these things into your story, because brownfields do have something to do many times with their surroundings, their neighborhood, their public health, their public welfare. Next slide. And then your demographics that you requested on the application, you need to provide and contrast your data, such as if you're using a census tract, you may want to compare that against the city or town, compare that against the county, compare that against the state, against the federal. Give them an idea of how your demographics vary because of all the brownfields in your community from surrounding areas, and connect the dots. Explain and expand on those statistics. Also use other data in the demographics. The EPA requests things like population, unemployment, poverty rate, percent minority, median household income, but you may want to include things that are pertinent to your area, such as the percentage of children under 5, maybe the high percentage of seniors, families in poverty, those types of things. And then when you're discussing health impacts, you go into those public health impacts where you have higher than normal cancer rates, strokes, heart disease, infant mortality, that type of thing. Clearly describe the social and economic situation of your targeted area and your inability to pay for this project. Why are you even going after this grant? Why can't you afford to do this work on your own? Next slide. So the project description is all about the plan. Here's the plan, here's how we're going to spend the money, and here is how we're going to get more money to get redevelopment or to go on to redevelopment. Describe the tasks it will take to do the job. An example is we need, for an assessment grant, we need to do phase 1s and phase 2s. You break those into tasks. Describe the timing of the implementation. How will you accomplish the task you've outlined within the grant period? That's very important to the EPA. They want to know you're going to spend the money within that 3-year, or for revolving loan fund, 5-year period of time. How does your project align with community plans? It's great to have the community's fingerprints all over the plans that you are actually implementing along with Brownfields redevelopment. The budget is outlined with only eligible tasks. Make sure your numbers add up, and even as a seasoned grant writer, I've been caught with numbers that don't add up. Don't lump sum things. If you have a program manager, make sure you're putting things like person at X dollars per hour for X hours at a total cost. This is an area that TAB can help you. We can help you with putting together a reasonable budget if you would like that type of assistance. We could also assist you with the timing and how you outline those tasks. Describe the other sources of funding, resources that you have or may be seeking to ensure completion. How will you complete the project? TIF? Will you be using CDBG, Ohio EPA, or Department of Development types of funding? This is something that you need to talk about. How are you going to get to the end game? Next. So community engagement is extremely important to the EPA, and my history with Brownfields redevelopment is that this is about partnerships. It's always been about partnerships. Partnerships with other agencies within your local government, partnerships within the community, partnerships with the state, health departments, your workforce development partners. This is very important to talk about community engagement and how you're partnering to get to project completion. Let's go to next slide, which also includes community engagement, getting that grassroots involvement. Who are your grassroots partners? Well, this is the cornerstone for the Brownfields program, grassroots involvement. Consider again who's impacted by the Brownfield sites, who's going to benefit the most from Brownfields redevelopment. And this is a good time to check out successful grant applications on TAB EC website to get ideas about how other communities engage the public or who they had involved. Next slide. So you not only have to involve them, but you have to keep them involved through the project. If you've engaged the public in the past for other projects similar to the community development, were they successful approaches and methods? If so, use those again and explain why you're using those methods. That makes sense. Describe the community-based organizations and their committed roles. So involve the partners that are relevant to your project plans. These can be grassroots organizations like local chambers of commerce, neighborhood associations, Main Street associations, civic groups, scout troops, community action programs. Well, what can they commit? Well, they can commit space for meetings. They can commit assisting you with the education outreach. They can put updates about your project on their Facebook. They can assist you with identification of sites. And also, many of these organizations can provide outreach to impoverished folks in the community that are your targeted community. Next. Project benefits. So here are the anticipated outcomes. How does my target area benefit from redeveloping brownfield sites? Describe the welfare, environmental, and public health benefits. The benefits need to be tied to the needs section. Be as quantitative as possible. Also describe economic and other community benefits. So I'm going to give you an example. The rural community that I discussed earlier. So we know that they had drug problems, overdoses, a lot of families in poverty. They wanted to develop one of their sites as a rehab center for pregnant moms. that are addicted to drugs. This ties into their needs of removal of that abandoned building with the renovation, assisting the mothers in poverty, drug abuse recovery, infant mortality. That was a big issue for them. So tie your benefits to how you expressed what your need was next. Programmatic capability and past performance. You need to show EPA that you can successfully manage the grant. Again, I think this is a good time to go back and look at those other applications. What were their environmental results? This really helps turn the wheels for how you can respond to the criteria in the application. Next slide. So in the end, be memorable, be compelling, like my granddaughter here. The best applications are written from the heart of the community with input from stakeholders. That really is. There are many ways that TAB can assist. Give us a call. And with that, happy writing.
Well, thanks very much, Beth, especially for the Superman reference. That really, that was, I'm not sure who that was. It wasn't me. But we do, a couple of points I'll make real quick about TAB is, we have some very good folks, over 40 partners now. They're, in planning, they're planners, they're environmental folks like Beth and I. We're both professional geologists, and they're economic development folks. So we plug in where there's a gap. If you have a consultant, but maybe they don't do reuse planning, we have folks that you can bring in that can help with that. If you need preliminary market analysis of a redevelopment site, just to kind of show for sure your envisioned reuse is really viable, we can do that. So we just fit in wherever there's a gap to fill. And so I just wanted to say that. I also wanted to say can't even read my own writing. We've got some really good census and demographic statistics contacts on Tab EZ. There's helpful hints about that, and with references, people you can talk to in every state. So that includes Ohio. So I'll just wanted to mention those things. We still don't have any chat questions. So want to see if any of the other speakers wanted to make any additional points.
This is Carla again. I'd just like to urge everyone regarding the SAM registration. Don't just check to make sure that your SAM registration is current. To find out when it expires. I had one grantee last year who literally his SAM registration expired one day before the grant applications were due, and he ended up having to turn in his application late. And we accepted it, but that's because he'd been dealing with SAM for like the last week and had been having problems. They were having some serious issues. But anyway, make sure you know when your SAM registration expires.
Thanks, Carla. I've even seen where everything's in place, but the point of contact has changed, and maybe the person's moved on to a different job, and and that's been a holdup. I've seen that happen too. Yeah,
there are lots of ways to get snagged up in SAM.
Right. Any other points?
This is Katie. I would just add, I have used the Tab EZ program myself, to do some grant writing, and I found it extremely helpful. And the folks over in Blaze's group were quick about a review and gave us some really good pointers on how to just take our application to that next step. I would suggest this for any level of grant writer, beginner to seasoned. It's always helpful to have that extra set of eyes. And if you have the time, especially unless you're like me and up to the wire, putting your documentation together. But I would highly recommend it. It was very helpful.
Thanks, Katie. And it's a pleasure to help folks out. So the main thing we need is about a 1 week advance notice that you're going to be sending in a draft proposal for us to review. And, you know, the farther out in front of the actual deadline, the better. But when we're chugging along, we can usually turn them around in a couple of days, if not the same day. But if it, you know, the closer to the deadline, the harder it is to get it back quickly. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's wrap up with Katie, a brownfield coordinator with Ohio EPA, telling us about a success story where a number of resources kind of came together to get a successful redevelopment project to happen.
Thank you, Blaze. And I know we're coming up to our time frame, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'm just going to do a really brief overview of this, and then you'll have the slides available to you and whatnot. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But just quickly, there's the city of Elyria. They had a project, it's your quintessential brownfield site called General Industries. It was a manufacturing facility for almost 100 years. They did everything there. And, it had some of those big problems. It had a fire in 2008. Once the big manufacturer moved out, it was kind of partially used and partially unused, and the building really fell into disrepair. And then, the mayor of Elyria really took this project on and championed the project. It took them 2 full years to get through just the assessment portions of the project, having to piece together the funding resources, and we'll go through that in just a minute. The good news, give away the end here for this project, is the next door neighbor, the adjacent property owners, a plastics manufacturer, and once the site was assessed to the point that they felt comfortable to move forward with purchasing some of that property so they could perform an expansion of their own, that's when other funding like Jobs Ohio funding here in Ohio became available to the city to make that next step happen. So lots of parts and pieces, and we'll look at the list here in just a few minutes. But I want to run through a couple pictures with you. If you want to move that next slide, Blaze. So it's a picture of a picture. But this is the historic manufacturing facility, very large. I would say probably, if you were to put it in city block size, at least a full city block, probably under roof there. So very interesting. You can go to that next one. Now this is a clip from an old Sanborn map, and if you can see all the buildings crammed in there, they used every square inch of that place for manufacturing facilities. So when you're going through that assessment, like Dan was talking about earlier, you're going to have a lot of identified areas here and areas of concern for potential contamination. Next slide. And then that happened. In 2008, there was unfortunately a tremendous fire at the facility. And, the owner of the property at the time, did not have the wherewithal to, rehabilitate a structure of that size and all sorts of issues. You can go to the next slide, please. And this is kind of what the city was left with. Rubble piles, debris piles, one building left standing, and it just looked like, significant blight. And it was right on their commercial corridor. So anyone coming into that area, going to their established businesses, would have to drive right past it. It was a real issue, and a real issue that the Mayor Brenda took on. Get that next slide. But with the funding sources, this is almost all demolition and complete. We just have a little bit left there. And I can tell you today that the demolition is complete. The property is ready for that next step for cleanup and revitalization. Next slide there. So this is what I would call the capital stack for this project, just to get it to that demolition and cleanup phase. These are all the parts and pieces that came into play in, as I mentioned, US EPA actually came in and did a removal action at this property after the fire, and that's just to address the worst of the worst, just immediate health threats. It doesn't clean up the whole site, but they do eliminate those immediate needs. So that happened. And then US EPA Region 5 They have a small brownfield program they call Targeted Brownfield Assessment, just like Ohio. Here at Ohio EPA, we call it the same. They have some funding available, so if you're in between grant periods or whatnot, and you need a phase 1 done, you don't have funding of your own, you could reach out to us or them. And in this case, they reached out to US EPA. And then for phase 2, they did have access at that point to some brownfields funding, and they were able to secure a Clean Ohio Fund grant, one of the last ones, in fact, for phase 2 assessment. The property did need some additional investigation off the property. There was concerns about contamination leaving the property, and they are in a commercial area, but there's also some residences nearby. So Ohio EPA, we stepped in with our targeted brownfield assessment program and did that off-site investigation for them. And then lastly, they were able to use a little bit of that Clean Ohio money, the last bit of it, and that Jobs Ohio funding once they had their end user secured to do the demolition and cleanup phases. Lots of parts and pieces going there. On the last slide here, other brownfield funding sources. These are all links, so when you download this presentation off TAB's website, you'll be able to click to these. These are other funding sources, you know, in addition to the EPA grant program. You know, we can use these funds in conjunction, you know, to further leverage your brownfield grant program. These are excellent resources, I think, to mention in your grant write-ups as opportunities for leveraging funds. But we do have a TBA, Targeted Brownfield Assessment Program, here in Ohio to do those phase 1s and very limited phase 2s. And as I mentioned, Region 5 has a program similar to that. There's the Ohio Brownfield Fund. That's Ohio Development Services Agency, their brownfield funding. That is loan dollars available for both phase 2 and cleanup. And then Jobs Ohio Revitalization Program. That program has loan and grant dollars available for projects that will be creating new jobs. And then finally, new to Ohio, we have the Abandoned Gas Station Cleanup Program. And that is just for what it says, gas station sites, and that would be through the folks over at Buster. As Dan mentioned earlier, the underground storage tank regulation folks, they regulate that, but there's some grant funds out there for those projects as well. So be sure to click on those links when you download the presentation, or feel free to reach out to Dan or I, and we're happy to point you in the right direction on those. I think that's, we'll use that as our wrap up and our close, and then any questions before we end our session here, we'll be happy to answer them.
Well, thanks, Katie. That's a great story, and I'll just make the comment that it seems like it always is a combination of funding types, you know, usually starting off with either EPA or state EPA environmental resources, so the ARC grants, and then the assessment work that Ohio EPA does. It kind of gets the ball rolling, but then it's those other funds, and Ohio is a great state for additional types of funding for demolition and cleanup, and you know, the other funding for bricks and mortar type work to implement the redevelopment that really make it all happen and draw in that extra private capital that really makes things work. So thanks to all our speakers, great presentations, and a great state to do brownfields in, as many of you I think know. So we have no additional chat questions, but we have a lot of folks on the line still. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody and see if anyone has any, you know, wants to verbally express any questions. And as long as we don't get horrendous feedback or anything, we'll give that a shot. So I've just unmuted everyone, and would like to ask, if you've got a question to ask, just speak up with your name first, and who you're with, and then ask a question, and we'll see if we can answer it. Anybody got a question? You're all pretty much all unmuted. Some of you aren't. For some reason, I can manually make sure you're all unmuted. Questions, comments. Okay. Well, how about from our speakers? Let me mute everybody again and unmute our speakers who are unmuted now. Okay. Any final comments from anyone? I think I'm having a hard time seeing. Yep. Okay. So all the speakers are unmuted.
Blaze, this is Katie. Just a quick question. Will the participants of this webinar, will they be sent a survey?
Yes, thanks. They will be sent a survey.
Blaze, this is
Yeah.
Sherry.
Go ahead, Sherry.
For the administrative coordinating side of it, we don't really have a way to send a survey to folks connected by phone. What I'd like to ask is if you will check back to the workshop webpage in a couple days. Under the documents, there will be a survey. And if you can finish that or answer the questions and email it back, we can give you credit for attending and send you a certificate. If you're attending and you did not register, send us an email. We can get you backdated, registered. And again, if you answer the survey questions, we can know that you attended and we can get you a certificate.
And thanks, Sherry. And that email address you see in the middle of the last slide at chsr@k-state.edu. And again, the phone numbers work too, but email is good as well. Any other final comments? Well, with that, I will thank all of you and wish you luck as you start getting your ducks in a row to apply for EPA ARC grants. And don't be a stranger. Call Katie's group, Carla, for eligibility things for sure, and also just project viability. They're great partners. Like I said, in Ohio, Ohio is one of the very best of the 21 states we work in. It's one of the very best places to do brownfields and to get your questions answered. So don't be shy, and by all means give us a call. Talk to Beth or me, and we'll see how we can help get you prepared. Or even if you're not interested in going after an EPA ARC grant, we can still help you out. So with that, thanks everyone, and thanks Katie and Dan for convening and expressing interest in doing this webinar. And with that, we are adjourned.